His name was whispered like a curse across the pine flats of North Carolina. Lazarus, a man whose patience was a slow, precise instrument of vengeance. Picture 9 lanterns swallowed by darkness, 9 white faces around a card table, 9 lives folded into the hush of a cabin that sat alone in a sea of resin, drunk trees. Imagine the smell of pine and spirits, the thin laughter of men who believed law and color made them untouchable. Imagine that laughter extinguished by a single night's design. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. This is not spectacle. This is a ledger of quiet calculation. Lazarus was not sudden fury, he was weather-made ruthless. By 1856 he had been born, worked, and learned inside the tar pentine camps where resin stained skin and thinking was sharpened by hunger. He belonged to Cyrus Hartwell but was leased into the forest where supervisors ran kingdoms with whips and ledgers. They were men like Samuel Putt and Silas Pharaoh, rough and petty lords who skimmed profits and stole people. They took more than money. They took dignity, food, time. And in taking those they shaped the precise geometry of a man's revenge. You should subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, your town, your state, right now in the comments woven into the anonymity of this telling. Do it as a promise to the story itself. The Tarpentine Woods were a different country. Longleaf pines that blurred amber, swamps that kept secrets, cabins spaced like islands where oversight could not reach. In those islands the 9 supervisors made their private rules. They gambled, they drank, they kept ledgers of theft, and they believed the law would never touch them. They were wrong. Lazarus moved inside that world like a shadow taught to breathe the same air as its quarry. He learned where vapors pooled, how spirits of tar clung to rags and corners, how a sealed room became a trap when the wrong elements met. He taught himself to read on scraps, not to decipher statutes, but to read men the cadence of their poker nights, the cadence of their slurpers, the exact hour when the shutters would be latched and the door bolted. He memorized the patterns they trusted. And then he waited. An oath formed in his chest. Cold, patient, inevitable. The tar camps of Cumberland County were not just work sites. They were laboratories of cruelty disguised as industry. The air itself was an irritant, heavy with resin and smoke, a fog that softened the line between exhaustion and delirium. Every sound was amplified there. The thud of an axe, the crack of a whip, the faint scream swallowed by forest. The 9 supervisors ruled their sections like priests of pain. Each had a signature form of punishment. Samuel Putt's whip cut in 3s, 1 for disobedience, 1 for defiance, 1 for example. Jedidiah Stokes starved men for lateness. Elias Crenshaw locked runaways in boxes no larger than coffins. Lazarus endured and observed. He had learned long ago that silence was not submission, it was storage. Every insult, every bruise, every lash. He kept them like measurements for a future construction. He watched their routines, Putt's obsession with his whiskey, Stokes' compulsion to count barrels, Pharaoh's habit of keeping a ledger under his cot. He noted where they stored tar barrels, how long before the vapors grew dense, how quickly fire spread when wind shifted. But it was not numbers that broke him, it was Dina. His wife, stolen into servitude by men who believed bodies could be traded as easily as barrels. She was light in the dark, and when they took her, the air itself soared. Pharaoh's cruelty had reached for her first, and the forest bore witness. The others joined in punishment to remind the rest that love was rebellion. They whipped him before her, then separated them. Her belly already carrying life. He was sent west, to the swamps near Lumber River, a distance measured not in miles but in grief. There he worked waist deep in water, surrounded by snakes and fever. The overseers believed the swamp would swallow him, but the swamp became his tutor. It taught him silence deeper than death, patience longer than pain. He studied the way tar ignited, how smoke suffocated before it burned, how spirits of turpentine clung to cloth, invisible and waiting. Every discovery was a verse in a quiet psalm of revenge, and though he prayed to no god, his vengeance began to take on the rhythm of scripture. Months passed, and his body became lean as the tools he handled. He spoke less. Even laughter from the other workers seemed to slide past him like wind through reeds. The swamp hardened him into calculation. Every day, he memorized something. The heat of resin, the spread of flame, the direction of wind through the trees. His mind became a crucible, refining pain into precision. Then came Isaiah, a young worker sent from the main camp with news heavy enough to kill a man twice. Dina had lost their child. Forced to lift a boiling pot under orders from Hosea Talbot, she collapsed in pain. The baby, a boy, was stillborn 2 days later. No ceremony, no marker, just another mound of earth behind the cooking shack. When Isaiah told him, Lazarus did not weep. The swamp was watching, and men who cried were marked. He only nodded once, eyes narrowing to a point so sharp it seemed to cut the dusk itself. That night, he stood alone in water up to his knees, the surface reflecting the moon like a silver coin. He whispered the names of the 9 men, once each, so that the forest would remember them if he died. Revenge was no longer an emotion, it was a duty, a form of balance. You listening to this? Yes, you understand this truth. There are moments when suffering evolves into mathematics. Lazarus began to calculate not how to survive, but how to end an ecosystem built on his blood. Hit that subscribe button if you can feel this shift, this turning of silence into weapon, and drop your location in the comments. The more who know, the harder it is to erase what follows. When Lazarus was finally returned to the main camp 8 months later, they said he had been rehabilitated. The supervisors believed their punishments had worked. They saw obedience where there was only construction. Dina was gone, sold south to a plantation no one could name. Lazarus learned this without expression. His heart had gone still like tar before fire. They gave him back his tools. They gave him back access. What they didn't realize was that they had given him back proximity, and that was the same as giving him a loaded gun. The 9 men still gathered on the first Friday of every month in Silas Pharaoh's cabin, their mock sanctuary where stolen money and laughter mixed with whiskey fumes. They thought their crimes invisible, but the forest saw, and now, so did Lazarus. He began to piece together their greater theft. Barrels of turpentine skimmed from every crew, hidden in hollowed shacks, sold under cover of darkness to smugglers who paid in gold and liquor. The men lied to their overseer, lied to the owners, lied even to each other. But Pharaoh, ever the coward, kept records. Beneath the loose floorboard of his cabin sat a single ledger. Numbers, names, amounts, proof of every theft, and therefore of every sin. Lazarus found it once by chance and timing. He read just enough by moonlight to memorize what mattered, and then replaced it exactly. That night, he understood that their greed was his map. Their ledger wasn't just their insurance, it was their anchor. If the cabin burned, so would their evidence. If the ledger vanished, suspicion would divide them. But he wanted more than their ruin. He wanted purification. Type, the veil is broken, twice in the comments, not as ritual but as resistance. Because what comes next is not just vengeance, it is transformation. He studied the ledgers of their habits now, not of numbers, but of flesh. Puig drank until he blacked out after midnight. Talbot chewed tobacco laced with turpentine, his lips always cracked. Garraway locked the cabin from the inside each meeting, paranoid from guilt. And each month they stored their profits under the floor, sealed the windows to hide the light, and trapped themselves in a room thick with fumes. The fire would need no permission. It would wait, patient, invisible, like a god of his own making. Lazarus began to prepare. He gathered small jars of spirits, stolen in ounces so minor no man noticed. He hid them in the woods. He crafted rags soaked in resin, buried glass in cool soil. Everything he needed was already given by their own industry. The forest, the vapors, the greed. All that remained was to decide when to let fire speak. By January of 1856, the plan had hardened into clarity. The first Friday of February. That would be the night. The air would be dry, the wind steady from the east. He knew the layout of Pharaoh's cabin, where the cracks in the shutters leaked, how the floor dipped near the center beam, how tar smoke gathered low to the ground before dispersing. He began to craft what he called his gift, a device meant to start without touch. He had read of delayed flames in a discarded newspaper, white phosphorus that ignited when air reached it. He couldn't find phosphorus, but he understood the principle timing through suffocation. So he experimented. He wrapped matches, heads broken off, inside bundles of cloth soaked in spirits, sealed them in jars with rags twisted through the corks. A slow bleed of air, he reasoned, would eventually reach the match heads, sparking heat that would ignite the vapors. The fire would begin from within, unstoppable. To test his creation, he built smaller versions near the swamp. Twice they failed, but the third time the jar hissed softly before the rags burst into flame. Not instantly, but after nearly 20 minutes. That delay was the key. He smiled for the first time in months. And so, as February's first Friday approached, Lazarus mapped every movement like scripture. He arranged for witnesses to place him elsewhere at the hour of the meeting. He volunteered for night watch over a distant still, miles away. The overseer agreed. Lazarus was the most trusted hand now. Perfect. That night, as the supervisors gathered to drink and divide their spoils, he would slip through the trees, unseen, the forest itself holding its breath. The devices were already buried under Pharaoh's cabin, planted days earlier when he delivered firewood. One under the table, one beneath the floor near the barrels, one behind the stove. All he had to do was wait. If you're still listening, don't just watch. Witness. Subscribe. Comment your city. This isn't just history. It's a warning about what happens when a system builds its own executioner. When the 9 men locked the door that night, they also sealed their tomb. The night of February 2nd, 1856, came dressed in calm. The wind moved only enough to stir the pine needles into whispers. The moon hung low, swollen, its light milky through a thin fog. Lazarus sat alone at the distant still, the flames licking beneath a copper kettle, his shadow long and patient against the wall. From this distance, the Hartwell tar camp was aglow behind trees, lanterns flickering like the last eyes of dying gods. He could hear laughter faint and dull, carried by the night. The laughter of men who believed they'd tamed the forest. They drank, sang, slapped the table. The same table where the ledger rested, where his wife's name had once been cursed as property. He closed his eyes, counting slowly. The delay would be near 20 minutes. At the cabin, the air was already thick. The men poured whiskey and oil lamps blazed against the wood. They had sealed the shutters to keep out the cold, not realizing they'd sealed in their doom. The fumes from barrels below began to swell, invisible, deadly. At the still, Lazarus whispered each of their names again, not as prayer, but as punctuation. Put, Farrow, Crenshaw,
Talbot, Garraway, Reeves, Stokes, Mott, Hale.
The first explosion was not loud. It was a sigh, a deep exhale as the cabin inhaled flame. The walls went orange, the windows belched smoke. Then came the roar, a sound like 1,000 trees falling at once. The sky turned copper. Birds fled in all directions. Lazarus did not move. He only watched as the horizon pulsed, his vengeance now alive, walking through timber and tar. He could almost hear their screams carried by the wind, the panic of men who had ruled with fire now swallowed by it. The ground trembled beneath him, and the air carried the stench of burnt resin and flesh. The forest had answered, and when it was done, silence fell again, just the hum of crickets and the faint hiss of dying embers miles away. He lifted his lantern, turned toward the swamp, and disappeared into the dark. By dawn, the camp was in chaos. Smoke still curled from the charred skeleton of Pharaoh's cabin. The roof had caved inward, the walls black and glistening like burnt sugar. No one had survived. The 9 men, or what was left of them, were unrecognizable. Rumors began instantly. Some said a barrel had exploded by accident. Others saw the devil himself had come to collect his debt. A few whispered the name Lazarus, but only in fear, not accusation. He had been seen at the distant still the whole night, firelight reflected in a dozen honest witnesses. He returned to camp at sunrise, face calm, hands steady. When Overseer Harlan demanded answers, Lazarus simply bowed his head. "Fire don't need a reason," he said softly. "It only needs a place to start." For days, the stench hung over the camp. The dead were buried in a shallow trench near the edge of the woods. Wooden crosses marked each grave, carved crudely by hands that trembled more from guilt than grief. No priest came. The fire had done the sermon. But even in death, the 9 men refused peace. Strange things began to happen. Tools went missing. Fires rekindled at night where there should have been none. Horses bucked and refused to go near the ruins. One night, a boy claimed he saw figures moving in the smoke, shapes of men still burning, still playing cards. Lazarus never denied it. "Fire don't stop when the wood's gone," he said once, his eyes far away. "It moves to memory. A word spread beyond the forest. Travelers along the Wilmington Road spoke of blue flames that rose from the tar pits without wind, voices whispering from the ashes. Locals began calling it the Night of Nine Flames, and though the plantation owners hushed the story, the workers knew. In whispers and work songs, they began to tell it, not as tragedy but as prophecy. For every lash and theft and sin that went unpunished, they said another Lazarus would rise. Weeks passed. The camp was rebuilt under new management. Overseer Harlan brought in fresh labor, claiming the fire had been an industrial mishap. But the men worked slower now, eyes always toward the woods. The forest had memory. Lazarus stayed silent, moving like smoke between tasks. His work was precise, his obedience perfect. He neither smiled nor prayed. But sometimes, at dusk, when the air turned thick and amber, his gaze would drift toward the charred clearing where the cabin once stood. No grass grew there, only scorched earth and the faint, sweet smell of resin. Then came a new visitor, a government investigator from Raleigh named Edwin Clancy, a man of ink and manners, boots too clean for the swamp. He questioned everyone. He took notes, made sketches, examined the ruins. He was polite but persistent. When he spoke to Lazarus, he tilted his head, curious. "You were alone the night of the fire?"
Yes, sir.
Lazarus said. "And you heard nothing? Just the wind?" Clancy frowned. Strange how wind carries flame uphill. Lazarus didn't answer. His silence stretched until even Clancy seemed uneasy. That night, Clancy stayed near the ruins to take measurements. By dawn, his tent was empty. The only sign of him was a single boot print leading toward the swamp, and another set of tracks that ended in the mud. Some said quicksand took him. Others swore they heard laughter drifting through the trees. After that, no more investigators came. The matter was declared closed. But Lazarus was not done. There were others. Men who had profited from the Nine, who had signed off their brutality from comfort miles away. He began to travel on foot, north through counties and woods, carrying only a satchel and his silence. And wherever he went, barns burned. By summer, whispers of the firewalker spread through 3 states. In Tarboro, a storehouse went up in flame, killing the foreman who'd beaten a boy to death the week before. In Halifax, a mill caught fire during service, its owner found charred beside his desk. A half-burned ledger in hand. No thief, no witness, only the faint smell of spirits and pine. Everywhere, people began to speak of a man in dark clothes who appeared days before disaster, polite, quiet, always leaving before dusk. Some said he had no shadow. Some swore his eyes were gold in the firelight. Lazarus had become myth, but he was no ghost. He was flesh, bone, and purpose. Each fire he set followed a pattern. Not random destruction, but correction. The victims were always those who'd built their fortunes from the broken. He made sure of that. He studied their maps, their ledgers, their sins. He spoke only once to a young enslaved boy who'd asked if he was afraid. "Afraid," Lazarus said. "Fear's what keeps men from doing right. I ain't afraid. I'm only late." As plantations burned, officials began calling him the Tar Devil. Posters went up, rewards offered, but no one turned him in. The people whispered protection. Mothers told children his story like bedtime gospel. A man who burned injustice itself. Still, vengeance has appetite, not mercy. One night, as Lazarus prepared his next fire, he saw something that stopped him cold. A charm. A small bracelet made of cloth and beads, the same kind his wife Dina used to wear. He found it near a riverbank, tied to a branch. His pulse slowed. Could she be alive? The fire that night never started. Lazarus turned from the flame for the first time. He followed rumor and rode northward through Bladen-Johnston, then up toward Nash County. Every mile, he asked in whispers about a woman named Dina. Some said yes, a woman who sang work hymns in a voice that made men cry. Some said no, she died years ago. Hope became both his map and his torment. In one town, an old freedman told him, "Ain't no fire strong enough to burn love out of the world. You just gotta find the smoke that's left." He reached a small plantation outside Rocky Mount and found her name in a ledger. Dina, female, 28, transferred 1856 from Hartwell to Jordan Estate. She was alive, but when he arrived, it was already too late. The Jordan Estate had burned weeks before. Lightning strike, they said. Only ashes remained. Workers whispered that a woman had sung through the flames, her voice rising above the roar until the roof collapsed. Lazarus stood in the ruins, knees sinking into ash. For the first time, his silence broke. He screamed, not in rage, but in the soundless grief of a man who had lived too long for his own vengeance. When dawn came, he walked to the river, placed his hands in the current, and let the water cool them. Some say he vanished there, the river taking him whole. Others say he was seen years later in Mississippi, older, carrying a single lantern, walking roads no one else dared travel. But every autumn, when the tar camps burn their resin fires, and the smoke turns blue under the moon, people still claim to see a man watching from the tree line, silent, patient, eyes gold in the dark, and the wind still carries his whisper, "Fire don't die. It just waits." Years turned like pages in a book scorched at the edges. The plantations that once fed on resin and sweat began to crumble under drought and rumor. Workers whispered of omens, flames that appeared without spark, ashes that refused to cool. The name Lazarus became a word not spoken in anger but reverence, the syllables wrapped in caution, like touching an ember and remembering it could still burn. In the shanties and woods, old men told the children, "If you work a man till his back breaks, the firewalker will come for you." They didn't mean it as threat, they meant it as law, the kind the earth itself enforces when written blood deep. In 1861, when war finally tore through Carolina, soldiers marching through the longleaf forests claimed the air smelled wrong, too sweet, too heavy, as if the pines themselves were bleeding memory. Camps burned without cause. Supplies vanished into smoke. More than once, entire squads woke to find their rifles charred and useless, footprints leading into the swamp. One corporal swore he saw a man kneeling by the ruins of a cabin, his hands black with soot, whispering over a mound of earth. When the corporal called out, the man looked up, eyes glowing faint and amber, then vanished as if swallowed by the dark. Even the Confederates began to avoid that region. Maps marked it with a single word, cursed. But among the freedmen, the story was salvation. They sang it into hymns, their voices low and fierce. Lazarus walked the fire road, hands don't shake, heart don't cold. If the master sins, his house gonna fold, fire walk down, take what it's owed. The song spread faster than soldiers could burn the plantations it came from. In every verse, vengeance turned to prophecy, and every time a new overseer died sudden, a lamp kicked over, a house gone by dawn, they said softly, "The man ain't dead, he's just moved on." In 1870, a northern journalist named Thomas Redfield traveled south collecting what he called folk superstitions of the Reconstruction. When he reached Cumberland County, he heard of the Night of Nine Flames. The locals wouldn't speak of it during daylight. At night, they whispered like conspirators, of a fire too intelligent to be accident, of a man too patient to be myth. Redfield found the remains of Pharaoh's cabin buried beneath moss and roots. The earth still smelled faintly of tar when broken. Beneath one beam, he uncovered something strange, a glass jar, melted into shape, with a rag fossilized inside. It was almost beautiful, like a trapped breath of history. He took it north and published an article titled, "The Firewalker of the Tar Woods." The story went viral by 19th century standards. Serialized, debated, mythologized. Northern readers called it superstition, southern planters called it blasphemy. But for those who had lived under lash and ledger, it was gospel. The story changed with each telling. Some said Lazarus had been an escaped preacher turned avenger. Others said he was the devil himself, walking in borrowed skin. One woman swore her grandmother had danced with him once, and his palms were warm like the heart of a stove. Years later, when Redfield died in a mysterious house fire, people said the story had finally found its author. His journal was recovered half, burned, one line legible among the ash. The man was not flame. He was the reason flame exists. By the turn of the century, Lazarus had crossed the line between man and myth entirely. Folktales grew like weeds, every region had its own version. In Georgia, he became the Ember Man, walking barefoot through sawmill towns, burning injustice and leaving no footprint. In Alabama, he was the Pine Ghost. In Mississippi, Old Smoke, but all versions agreed on one truth. He punished greed disguised as order. Miners in Appalachia carved small talismans shaped like jars, worn around their necks to keep wicked men at bay. Black families migrating north carried the story with them like a relic, retelling it to children in cold Chicago tenements. There was a man who burned the men who burned the world. Churches didn't speak his name, but his logic infected sermons. Every sin, one preacher thundered, will find its fire. Congregations nodded, unaware that the phrase traced back to the tar pits of Cumberland County, to one man who'd turned pain into equilibrium. And yet, even myths cast shadows. In 1902, a lumber camp in Bladen County went up in a blaze so fierce it melted iron. Survivors claimed they saw a figure standing in the inferno's heart, calm, unburning. When they approached, nothing was there, only footprints leading toward the river. One witness, dying of smoke inhalation, whispered his eyes were gold. Time did what it always does. It blurred. By 1930, progress had paved over most of the Carolina pine barrens. Factories replaced tar kilns, and the descendants of both enslaved and enslaver worked side by side, forgetting who was who. But not all memory dies. Children dared each other to visit the fire ground, where Pharaoh's cabin once stood. Locals warned them not to whistle near sundown. It was said that fire followed sound. Every few years, a blaze would erupt mysteriously, a warehouse, a barn, a church, always on February's first Friday. Those who investigated found no accelerants, no cause, just melted glass and the faint scent of resin. During the Great Depression, a WPA folklore worker named Hester Cole recorded an interview with a 92-year-old man named Amos who claimed his grandfather had worked under Hartwell himself. His voice, crackling through static, said, "Firewalker weren't no ghost. He were just a man tired of watching wrong go unburned. Some say he dead. I say he just restin'. Fire don't die, son. It's sleep till it's called." That tape was archived and forgotten until 1987 when a local historian digitized it. On playback, faintly under Amos's voice, another sound emerged, a soft hiss. Then, almost a whisper, "Fire don't need a reason." Technicians called it interference. Locals called it proof. Now, in the age of glass screens and pixel ghosts, Lazarus has found a second life. His story resurfaces online every few years, under Reddit threads, TikTok edits, YouTube narrations whispered over crackling fire sounds. People claim to see him in photographs of old burn sites, a shadow with golden eyes behind the smoke. Skeptics laugh, believers listen. But what they all agree on is this: the fires have never stopped. Every year near February, unexplained blazes still occur in a triangle of land between Fayetteville, Tarboro, and Lumberton. Locals say it's coincidence, but firefighters report strange details. Flames that burn blue, structures ignited from within, no source ever found. Some say it's chemicals. Others say it's Lazarus, reminding the world that justice delayed still burns. If you've made it this far, comment, "The fire remembers," to let me know you're part of the ones who listen, not just watch. Because stories like this, they don't die, they wait. And if you ever smell sweet resin in cold air when no pine trees are near, leave. Don't look back. Because sometimes history isn't in the past. It's just looking for new kindling. In 2024, a wildfire broke out in Cumberland County. Locals called it the Glass Run Fire. It started in the Pine Flats, the same region where the tar camps once stood. Officials said lightning, but there was no storm that night. The air had been still, the sky clear. When firefighters arrived, they found something strange. The flames didn't behave like normal fire. They moved in lines, deliberate, curved, almost patterned. And at the epicenter, buried under a foot of scorched soil, was an object half melted yet intact, a glass jar, sealed with tar, a rag fossilized inside. Sound familiar? It should. The jar was sent to Raleigh for analysis, but it never arrived. The transport truck crashed 12 miles north, burned to its frame. The driver survived, repeating the same phrase again and again before slipping into shock. It wasn't the fire. It was the man. News outlets spun it into clickbait. The tar devil returns. Most dismissed it. But a few, historians, descendants, storytellers, recognized the pattern. It was February's first Friday. On social media, users began reporting anomalies, static in recordings, blue flickers in home footage from near the woods, a voice on police radios whispering through the frequency floor, "Fire don't need a reason." A group of students from NC State launched a documentary project called the Lazarus Code. They planned to trace every fire since 1856 to prove or debunk the legend. But during their second week in the field, one of their cameras caught something at 3:11 a.m., a figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of flame, tall still, watching. The next morning the footage corrupted. Only the audio survived, a low crackle, a heartbeat, and one line spoken clearly by a voice that didn't belong to any of them. Ledgers still open. The following weeks became a fever. Videos spread online, security footage, dashcams, drone shots of the fire line. Always the same shape, always the same calm. Conspiracy forums labeled it spectral arson. But the locals didn't need fancy words. They just called it Lazarus comeback. And maybe they weren't wrong. The fires began to follow a pattern, not random but precise. Each one targeted old logging sites, historical plantations turned tourist attractions, chemical plants built on the ruins of tar grounds. As if the flames were cleaning history's fingerprints one by one, fire crews reported malfunctions. Radios crackled with phantom voices. Thermal drones showed human outlines where none should be. Figures of heat walking within the fire, leaving no ash behind. One crew captain described it best in his incident report before disappearing during a later blaze. It's not spreading, it's choosing. And still, the same scent followed each site: pine, resin, and something older. Something almost sweet. Government agencies blamed faulty wiring. Insurance companies whispered sabotage. But locals began to gather again, just like in the 1800s. Not to fear, but to remember. They sang the old verse under their breath, as if to remind the fire who it belonged to. Lazarus walked the fire road, hands don't shake, heart don't coldly. This time, though, the song wasn't warning, it was invitation. In March, one of the surviving students from the Lazarus Code uploaded a final video. It was shaky, filmed in night vision, the green tint turning smoke into ghosts. He stood near what he said was the ruins of Pharaoh's cabin, the original site. Behind him, the air shimmered like heat above asphalt. They said the place was gone. It's not, he whispered. The ground, it's breathing. He panned the camera downward. The soil was pulsing, faintly glowing, as if embers lived just beneath the surface. Then, movement. A hand, dark, soot-covered, pressed upward from the ground. Not emerging, just reaching. The boy gasped. The frame jolted.
Oh God.
Oh God. He's still. The video cut to black. Authorities later found the camera, but not the student. Only a single boot print remained near the site, half filled with ash. Forensics dated the boot's tread to the 1850s. That upload has since been deleted. But if you search hard enough, pieces remain. Reploads. Grainy screenshots. People say if you play the audio backward, you can hear the words, "I never left." By summer, the fires reached into towns. But not indiscriminately. They spared schools, homes, the poor. They targeted banks built on slave profits, old courthouse archives that erased black history, museums that displayed bondage as culture. Firefighters said the flames avoided people, burning around them in perfect circles, leaving the innocent untouched. Scientists called it impossible, but eyewitnesses called it justice. In one viral clip, a woman filming from her porch saw a silhouette walking calmly through smoke. Tall, barefoot, no fear. The fire parted around him like water around stone. She whispered, "Sir, who are you?" And though the sound crackled, 3 words came through clear, balancing the books. The next day, her house stood untouched. The bank across the street was gone. The phenomenon spread, not just in Carolina, but in places linked by history's dark thread: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Always the same pattern, always the same night. February's first Friday, hashtags flooded the internet. The fire remembers. Faye Lazarus lives. 9 flames. The government called it mass hysteria. Scientists called it climate anomalies. But storytellers, people like you listening right now, knew better. And so, we arrive here, the present. The screen you're watching from, glowing in a dark room, is just another kind of fire. And through it, stories travel the same way flame does, invisible until they touch oxygen, until they touch you. Lazarus was never about one man. He was an equation, the point where oppression meets ignition. The fire was his body, the story his soul. Every time injustice rises again, so does he. Not as ghost, not as man, but as memory refusing burial. Some say he still walks the old tar trails watching, waiting for the next ledger to open. Others believe he became the fire itself, living in every spark, every protest, every voice that says enough. Maybe the truth is simpler. Maybe Lazarus never burned those men for vengeance at all. Maybe he burned them for balance. The same balance the earth demands when it's been wounded too long. So if you ever find yourself driving the back roads of North Carolina and you smell resin when no trees are near, don't linger. Because the past is still alive there. And fire, real fire, never forgets its name. Comment, the fire remembers, if you believe. Subscribe if you listen. And if your screen flickers right now, it's just history finding you.